Hi, I'm Glenn Shackleton, Director of Haunted Walks. Our episode begins in Kingston, Ontario today, where we have a brand new tour, Lakefront Ghosts and Legends. Now, Kingston's located right at the juncture between three important waterways, the St. Lawrence River with its 1,000 islands, the Rideau Canal, and Lake Ontario, all of which have their ghost stories and legends. And Kingston, of course, is no different. Kingston has tales going back centuries, including our very own sea serpent, perhaps a relative of the Loch Ness Monster. We also have tales of ghost and phantom ships in the area, and even some stories that include ships or crews that disappeared without a trace.
One of my favorite stories is the story of the disappearance of the Bavaria. The Bavaria was a ship that went missing in 1889 on its way back into Kingston. There were some searchers who were sent out to try to find this ship, and they did indeed find the Bavaria run aground on a small island here in the Thousand Islands. What they found on board was a little bit more strange. They discovered that there was absolutely no sign of the crew on board the ship, but they did find money still out on the captain's desk ready for counting, a fresh meal served in the galley, and a canary still chirping away in its cage. There was one small rowboat missing, but that certainly would not have held the entire crew. There was a lighthouse keeper who reported seeing this rowboat with two men on board. He took out his own ship and followed them a little ways. He called out to them, but there was no response. They continued rowing away so quickly, and he reported they were in some sort of trance-like state. No one ever saw those two men, that rowboat, or the rest of the crew of the Bavaria ever again.
At the Marine Museum in Kingston, we spoke to Curator Emeritus Maurice Smith about his own experience and tales of sailing the Great Lakes.
Now, some people say, well, it's never going to be like it is at sea, in the oceans of the world. The thing is that you will get 35-foot seas on Lake Superior. You'll get heavy, strong winds and spume being blown off the tops of the waves. But what you have on the lakes that they don't necessarily have at sea is that the shore is probably never more than 200 or 300 miles away, or more typically 35 or 40 or 50 miles away. So you get the same wind, you get almost the same waves, but always hovering nearby on the lakes are shores. And of course the enemy of any ship are shoals, reefs, and of course shorelines. So that's the danger of being on the lakes.
Now, of course, with any place that has some shipwrecks and certainly has some dark and stormy nights, you are bound to get some ghost stories and some stories of ghost ships on the waters. Now, can you give us any examples of some non-supernatural, explanations for why there are so many ghost stories certainly that seem to be around from the Great Lakes, particularly?
Well, I can remember an incident that occurred that I witnessed. I was aboard Pathfinder, and we were headed down towards Point Petrie, that area that I was telling you about. And it was a dark and stormy night eventually, but it was storms all around us. But the air was very, very dry, and you could almost hear the crackle in the air. And at one point we looked up aloft and we could see the yards of the square sails. And at the tips of the yards we saw this kind of bluish glow. And of course it scared the hell out of the kids. I mean, what the hell is going on here? And what it turned out to be, it had a kind of a bluish glow that bathed everyone in that light, and it really was mystical. But what it really was St. Elmo's fire. And it was just the transmission of static electricity. I think that's the explanation for it. Either between the clouds, the atmosphere, through the ship down to the water, or vice versa. I'm not certain which. You can look that up.
Sure.
But that was a very, very bad night. And there are some nights when the atmosphere just seems to close down, and where you have conversations, and you can hear the conversations quite clearly between fore and aft, but where everything does have a kind of an eerie presence to it. And those kinds of nights affect people.
Many sailors on Lake Ontario have reported seeing ghost ships, and one of the most famous is the ghost ship Garibaldi. Now, the Garibaldi was a schooner that was carrying a very heavy load of coal across Lake Ontario when it was hit by a very sudden and violent storm. The men on board the Garibaldi decided to weigh anchor and try to wait out the storm, but the cable snapped and the ship was thrown onto an offshore sandbar. Over the many hours of that terrible night, the ship was pounded by heavy waves, was hit by high winds and freezing rain, and and all the men on the ship could do was either go below decks or climb higher and higher into the rigging and lash themselves on tight and hold on for dear life. Well, the ship continued to be abused by heavy winds and rain and freezing rain throughout the night, and in the morning, when they found the ship, it was more ice than wood, and many of the men on board had perished in the night, including the ship's mate, who was found below decks, frozen solid. Now, since that terrible night, many sailors on Lake Ontario have reported seeing in the mists the image of the ghost ship Garibaldi with its phantom crew continuing to scramble higher and higher in the rigging in an effort to save their lives. To learn more about the St. Lawrence River, we headed east across the border to Clayton, New York, where we spoke with historian Norm Wagner at the Thousand Islands Museum. Certainly the area of the Thousand Islands is a place that is steeped in folklore and certainly ghost stories and certainly there are plenty of mysteries as well in the Thousand Islands.
Oh, yeah.
Would you say that that seems to be true, that it's a place that has particularly fond, I guess, of storytelling and the ghost stories and everything else?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of folklore and the ghost stories, and of course I mentioned the Maple Island mystery earlier. That centers around the assassination of President Lincoln.
Could you tell us a bit about the Maple Island mystery?
It's a fact, well documented in one of the books I have, that in the summer of 1865, a man came to Fisher's Landing, just downriver from Clayton, and stayed at one of the hotels, didn't sign his name, didn't register, but he had money to spend, but it was English money. That was a little bit odd, but back then it still wasn't that odd. They took his money, and so then he rented a boat, or he bought a boat, a skiff, and wandered around the islands, and eventually he bought lumber, had it delivered, built a cabin on a Maple Island, and which is fairly isolated, and minded his own business. He was very solitary, he kept to himself all that summer. So then in the fall, people noticed a fire on the island from Clayton. And they went down there, investigated, and they found his body by the water. He'd been murdered by someone, probably a group of men, because the ground on the island was all disarray and there was blood every place. And like I said, he was murdered, and there were 3 crosses carved into his chest. There was a conspiracy, of course, to do the assassination of President Lincoln and some of his cabinet members. The short version is this man reneged on his part of the assassination attempt and took the money.
Okay.
And then these people caught up with him and assassinated him.
Norm, you told us about some of the mysteries of the Thousand Islands, certainly some secret groups and other kinds of, I guess, more mysterious or bizarre characters, I guess, such as your story about Maple Island. And do you think that that might have anything to do with the amount of, I guess, legends and ghost stories and folklore in the place, that there were some kind of odd characters, I guess, around in the history of the Thousand Islands?
I would say that, yes, the Thousand Islands may have attracted people that wanted to be left alone. This man was called the Hermit of Maple Island also, so that puts a tag on it. And there certainly were a good share of strange people or characters in the Thousand Islands.
Well, as we've heard today, the Great Lakes and Thousand Islands are just full of great ghost stories and history. And here in Kingston, we're lucky enough to be right at the center of it all. If you do have a chance to join us on our Lakefront Ghosts and Legends tour this summer, and you happen to see something a little strange on the horizon, perhaps something coming from the mists, you might just want to remember our favorite quote: "Do I believe in ghosts? No, but I am afraid of them." We'll see you next time on Haunted Walk TV.
The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down of the big lake they call Gitchagumi. The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the skies of November turn gloomy.